Hello.
Yeah, I think you'd have to start broadcast.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Sweet.
Best of luck. Well done. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Huh? Do I need water? Do I need water? Maybe. It's okay. Okay. Ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Good afternoon. Ooh, we have 135 people today. This is great.
Great.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar on creating a persuasive pre-budget submission. My name is Tishini. I am the policy analyst here at ONN. If you're new to ONN, we are a provincial network for 58,000 nonprofits and charities, and we work to help strengthen the nonprofit sector by engaging and advocating with and for nonprofits and charities and communities across the province. So you're probably wondering, why now? Why this topic? Well, advocating to government and advocating about what issues and opportunities are important to communities and should be reflected to communities should be reflected in the budget. Thus, the budget is one way nonprofits can actively participate in creating effective public policy change, system change, as well as amplifying the voice of the people and communities they serve. So in this webinar, we'll be going over 3 points: the purpose of the pre-budget submission, the structure of your pre-budget submission, and sharpening your message and ideas. So before we dive in, I'm just going to give some kind of a technical debrief here. The webinar should last about an hour. If you miss anything, we'll be emailing all participants the recording and the slide deck following the webinar. You can also download the slides from the handout section during the webinar. So we've got a lot of people joining us today. I think it's about 147, pretty good. And so we've muted participants on the line to reduce noise disruptions. Also, we'll be hosting Q&A at the end of the webinar, so if any questions come up throughout the presentations, please feel free to send them in. Okay, so with us today, we have John Telch. He is a senior consultant for Maple Leaf Strategies, who will give an overview of how your organization can leverage the pre-budget submission to influence the provincial budget. Thank you for joining us, John.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. He's going to provide some additional tips on structuring and the communication around that. So do you want to give a brief introduction about yourself and then we can get started?
Sure. Well, thanks everyone for joining and for the Nonprofit Network for having me today. As Tishini mentioned, I'm a senior consultant at Maple Leaf Strategies. We're a GR firm here in Toronto, and we do work across Canada. I myself used to work for an MP in Ottawa on Parliament Hill, and then after that I started consulting and specializing in not-for-profits and environment and First Nations related work, and then brought my skills and services to Maple Leaf, where I work now. And as you can imagine, in the work that we do a lot of pre-budget submissions with our clients. So the team here at the Not-for-Profit Network and I sat down a little while ago and thought it would be great to share with interested members how the best pre-budget submission rolls out and how it can work with the new government.
Yeah. So let's get started. I can scroll down. So the provincial budgets, just some context here. So the provincial budget, what is it? It's an expression of government's public policy, a framework in which resources are spent, so how government will allocate resources over the next fiscal year. Also is indicative of the current state of the province's economy, and usually announced between March and May, so it kind of sets the line for what the government's going to be doing as of, say, April 1st for the fiscal year.
I would also just add to that the budget is an opportunity for the government to outline its priorities and where it will be focusing its attention, and that could be fresh off the heels of an election victory. This is where we campaigned, this is how we won, we are going to focus on these issues. Alternatively, it is in response to issues that they've inherited. Certainly with this government, they are focusing a lot on inheriting a major deficit and wanting to reduce that deficit, so the budget will be indicative of that policy priority.
Awesome. So what is the pre-budget submission? So the pre-budget submission is a way to provide recommendations to government as the government begins to plan for its fiscal year. It's a way to ask the government to take up certain policy action or decision. So thinking about what is your ask, what would you like to see, what changes would you like to see, and what kind of policy actions you'd like to come out of that. And also, it's practical, it's timely, and it responds to what the government needs. So John?
I think also a really simple way to look at what a pre-budget submission is and what it can do for you is it is an opportunity to audition your organization, your policy objectives, your funding hopes and dreams before the government. It is a process that they have to undertake to allow pre-budget submissions to come in and allow for consultation on those submissions. So this is your presentation of your CV, or like I said, an audition before the government to tell them about your priorities, how you can help them with their mandate, and how it will help the province.
Awesome. Next. So why is the pre-budget submission so important? So we want the government to take action. It's a way to allow the government to be informed. Like John said, it's like a CV. It's telling them about what you're interested in, what your organization is doing, and how your work affects people or supports communities. And thus, you need to kind of explain to government how the decisions in the budget will affect the people that you are working for, working with, or supporting. Also, it's an opportunity for you, as mentioned, to demonstrate that you are a part of the policy process, that you're willing to be engaged, that you're willing to work with government to help them achieve some of their policy goals, and as well as providing solutions that would support the communities that you serve.
I would also add that it is not easy to get in front of government and without getting too much into the weeds on the differences between one government or the next. I think it was easier for the sector as a whole to get in front of the previous Liberal government. With the new Doug Ford Conservative government, it is not so easy. The pre-budget submission is a way to get their attention, align with their priorities, and also report back to your own membership with this document that says, this is how we've approached the government. This is what we're asking for. This is what we'd like to see as a policy priority going forward. So it's also a bit of a communication and advocacy tool as well, if it's done correctly.
Awesome. So, what are the resources available to help your organization develop its submission? So we have the throne speech, kind of which sets out in some ways a mandate for what the government would like to achieve during the year. The fall economic statement, press releases and statements by ministries, the ministers, and the premier, party platforms, and public accounts, which are government revenues and expenses, and they're usually compared to in terms of outcomes, financial outcomes the government wants to see and measure to measure kind of what kind of the outcomes have been in regards to their spending and what they had actually planned to do. So in the case of party platforms, for example, it's actually good to look at the party platform from when Patrick Brown was formerly leader of the Ontario Conservatives. So looking at that plan, as well as these other documents to kind of provide a context and actually understand kind of the language the government is using and what their priorities are. John, I think you have some deeper tips on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree that all of these pieces listed in the slide in front of you are really important. Going through them one by one, the throne speech is really similar to the State of the Union in the United States. If you want to draw a comparison there, this is the government's opportunity to put basically a long speech that the Lieutenant Governor performs together that outlines what they want to achieve, perhaps how they're going to achieve it, and where they will be focusing their attention. So if you look at Doug Ford's first speech from the throne, it was a lot of focus on job creation, fiscal responsibility, getting Ontario back on track, open for business. So those pieces of language are really important for any government stakeholder, but especially I think the not-for-profit sector, because you have to target your asks in a way that aligns with those priorities that the Premier and his government have laid out. Similarly, the fall economic statement will give you a bit of an indication of what the government is willing to do financially. Not always the case, but usually it is that in this case of this government, we are running a major deficit. We're going to be fiscally responsible. It doesn't mean we won't spend, but we're going to be cautious about how we release money. Press releases and statements by ministers are similarly important. I would also usually add mandate letters to that, but this government has chosen that not to release their mandate letters, but always something worth considering. Party platform, I think, is an interesting one, because usually I would say, yeah, if you look at the party platform, you can identify priorities and use those to your advantage as a piece of leverage, but the reality is that this government won without much of a platform. They wouldn't admit that to you, but that's something important to keep in mind. So I think to Shini's point of looking at what the Patrick Brown Conservatives ran on is really important, and as well as public accounts and any relationships you might have with minister's office staff. They might tell you, our government priorities are X, Y, and Z, and then you can focus on those priorities.
Thank you, John. So we're going to do a quick poll before we get into kind of formatting your pre-budget submission. We just want to kind of get an idea of how many of you have actually, or how many of your organizations have submitted a pre-budget submission. So we're about to launch it. Awesome. Okay, 10 more seconds. Okay, so close poll. 80% have voted. Give it a few more. Okay, so we're going to close the poll. So we'll share the results of the poll. So 46% said yes, participants, and 54% said no. So that gives us an idea of kind of where everyone is at, and definitely knowing that this pre-budget submission webinar is very useful to you. So we're going to go into more detail now about the formatting of the pre-budget submission. So John, you can start.
Absolutely. Just addressing the poll as a political strategist, which is what we do in a government relations firm above research and above communications and other pieces of assistance. The first piece of advice that we would give any potential client, and that we will give all of you, is that you must submit a pre-budget submission. If there is anything you hope to achieve from the government, or any outcomes you hope to achieve with the government together, if you are content as an organization having the odd meeting, you don't require any funding, you don't need any program support, then you don't need to write a pre-budget submission. But if you, and that I think is a very small amount of organizations and people, but I think that it is pretty much obligatory that organizations, especially in this sector, take part in the budget process. Moving on to the layout. The layout of the pre-budget submission is a tricky thing to get absolutely perfect, because it is like no other document that you will ever write. As I was joking with Tashini before we started the webinar, it's kind of like a reverse resume. You are going to tell the employer, in this case the government, why you deserve the job first, and then justify your qualifications secondly. So you're going to start with a nice title page that's clean and crisp and has your organization, and included with that you could include a powerful quote from the sector that you work in, similar to the format that the Nonprofit Network has here. You also want to identify the date and who you're preparing it for. In this case, it would be the Standing Committee on Finance, or the Finance Minister, him or herself, and then have a short excerpt on who you are as an organization. So the format we chose to follow was the Nonprofit Network's format. It's perfect. It does exactly what we as strategists would hope to see, and as former staffer, I can tell you that I would want to read. And then once you've covered these things on your title page, you go right into a short executive summary. And in that executive summary, you are going to list your quote unquote asks, or as we call them in a nicer way, recommendations that the government support you with. And you are going to list those recommendations in order of, to be perfectly blunt, best to worst. So you're going to say what is most important up front and most likely to happen up front, and then go down the list, however many recommendations you have. I would try to keep it to 5 or less if you can, if at all possible, because you don't want this document to be too wordy. You're going to number them to demonstrate that priority. And then after you've listed what it is that you want, you spend the rest of the document justifying it. This is why we think it's important. This is why you should support it. This is why you should pay for it. And then we can keep moving from there. So in your asks of the government, these need to be actionable. The language needs to be direct. It needs to be simple. It needs to be very easy to understand. And the reason I say that is that there is some poor policy advisor in the Ministry of Finance office who gets all of these documents. And if you imagine that everybody in the sector submits a pre-budget submission, that is a lot of reading. So the simpler you can make it, the easier to digest you can make it, the better chance you have. And also the more concise you can make it, the better chance you have. Less is definitely more, so don't get overly wordy or into too much explanation. But other than understanding your audience, which is so important, you need to speak the government's language. And if I can be blunt, but hopefully not too crass or rude, if you have submitted a pre-budget submission before and you have sent it to the previous Liberal government, that language, I can guarantee you, is not going to be acceptable for this government. This government has completely different priorities, a totally different outlook on life and the sector that you're in, and you need to adjust to their priorities. So anytime you ask for funding support, you have to frame it as an investment. And what do you need with any investment? Return on that investment. So in your justification of $5 million for animal shelters across the province that are state of the art and new and wonderful, you need to demonstrate what return on investment the province gets. If you pay for these, you get job creation, you get safer animals, you get a reduction of Lyme disease and other things that dogs carry. You have to just demonstrate to them why your investment is a prudent one and speaks to their other priority, which is fiscal responsibility.
So on that note, we're going to talk about some ways to kind of develop your ask. So as you know, ONN's a network. So we encourage kind of consulting with peers, leveraging your networks to kind of see what's going on, see what everyone's talking about, see where things align. Sharing some of your work with public servants and asking for feedback, because they might have some inside knowledge about what's going on and maybe some of their projects or what they're costing out, because they're in the process as well of putting things together to be sent to finance, to be looked at, and to be put into the budget, or seeing if they can actually be aligned to be put into the budget. Share with key ministries. So if you have access to Ministry of Finance representatives who have your portfolio or work within the areas of your portfolio for your organization, contact them to see what they're doing. Also with the Treasury Board as well, because there's some processes there that are a bit more complex, and I'm not going to go into detail, and I'm no expert, but to kind of see where this aligns in terms of implementation and the frameworks and the directives and the processes that are there. Also seek advice on whether your proposal needs legislative change or policy change. Is it a simple regulation? So when you're asking for that feedback, is there a regulation that you could change that might make that one little push and be an ask that's actually very valuable to the government in achieving their goals, or even a ministry or a project that a ministry is working on. So those are some things to think about. I don't know if John has any more tips on other ways to develop your ask.
Yeah, I would say that if you have the luxury of being able to prepare for the budget cycle in advance, which is just a good practice for any organization, understanding the timelines as Tashini laid them out, when they tend to release the budget, when they accept consultations, when they accept pre-budget submissions, plan your meetings around that. If you have allies in the minister's office, if you are friendly with a policy advisor, you can sit down with them and meet with them and say, these are the kinds of priorities we'd like to put in our pre-budget submission. Do they align with what your government is thinking? And they might tell you yes, no, maybe, and give you some sort of direction on where your document should go. I would also add that legislative change in terms of a bill is a pretty big undertaking for any government. So if that's where your priorities lie, that's fine, but you do have to think a little bit about, is the appetite really strong for this piece of legislation? Will it pass? Should I bark up this tree? And it could be that that's a very good thing to do, but it's something that's worth considering, that if you can avoid putting together a bill, it's always easier than having to actually go through the process.
Mm-hmm. Also, I would also add on that in terms of the budget cycle and understanding that, and in the larger kind of political context, we know elections happen every 4 years, and we know that the government is actually preparing for election in the last year of its mandate. So being aware of that and also preparing for that. So I would say summer's a really good time to start thinking about what your budget asks may be, in line with that. And also just generally every year, we know that the budget's going to drop maybe in April, May, kind of knowing that the submission and the consultation process is going to be January to about March, and having that in mind, as John said, in terms of the process, and thinking about what you'd like to put on the table in terms of your budget ask, say in the summer or in the fall, to get that going, is a good step or a good thing to think about.
Absolutely.
Another ad we have is a different way to kind of figure out how you're going to communicate with government about your budget asks. At ONN here, we tried to do mapping of priorities. So we looked at the documents that we referenced to, so like throne speech, fall economic statement, things like that, and plotted kind of the themes in terms of words that we saw of government language and how they align with their priorities. So we kind of captured 5 of them. So the government wants to create jobs, good jobs. They want to make Ontario open for business. They want accountability. They want to generate prosperity, and they want it to have an impact on people's day-to-day lives. So we plotted that against, say, our policy agenda items that we have for 2018, 2019. And we looked at where our policy agenda items align with some of the messaging that the government has put out, and making sure to think about how we could align our messaging within that context that they're communicating in. So that's really a key point, and I find this mapping exercise to be both fun for a team to kind of go through, and interesting to see how the government is actually communicating and how you can attune some of your messaging in order to generate that outcome that you'd like in terms of policy.
Yeah, I think this is a great exercise for any organization. And I would say also not to lose too much heart if you try to make a chart like this and you can't really find where the priorities lie. Mm-hmm. It just might require a little bit more digging, a little bit more outreach to minister's office staff to understand where their priorities align. And if you happen to be speaking to a good member of staff, they're going to be pretty upfront, in my experience, about what excites them from a policy priority and what doesn't excite them from a policy priority. And that's where you strengthen your asks or take them away and adjust accordingly. Mm-hmm.
So speaking the language, John.
Government is a very strange, at times slow-moving, at times very quickly moving animal. But one of the most important things in government relations that we assist people with and organizations with is speaking the government's language. This really can't be understated as something that's important. If you present to the government, if you interact with the government, if you submit anything to the government, especially around the budget, and don't speak their language, you are absolutely dead in the water. You won't get any time for meetings. You won't be seen as a priority. They have other meetings that they can take that are with other organizations or with other sectors. So your language, especially in a pre-budget submission, has to really align nicely with what the government's priorities of the day are. And I think especially for the nonprofit sector, it couldn't be more important, because this is a sector that, not to generalize or stereotype, that this government will not see as a priority. That is just the truth. And I know it can hurt, but you have to make your organization align with their priorities to make yourself relevant. It's not like Kathleen Wynne's Liberals, where there was a little bit more of an open-mindedness, open door approach to the nonprofit sector. You have to do the work to align with this government, to get the face time, to make that positive change, and that all comes from your language. So perfect example is if I have 5 asks of the government in my pre-budget submission, 2 are policy and 3 are funding. All of my funding requests must revolve around positive investments. It is worth spending the money, and this is the return that Ontario gets on that investment. And that doesn't necessarily have to be that if you spend $5 million on me right now, you'll triple your money in 5 years. It can be that if you spend that money, you will create sustainable, lasting jobs. You'll help the sector become more independent and less reliant on government support, or whatever it happens to be. But you have to do the legwork to make sure you are speaking to them in their own voice. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very challenging.
So justifying your ask. So when you're justifying your ask, you're kind of identifying how the proposed solution will meet the objectives of the government, as John was saying, speaking their language, return on investment in this case, and what that return on investment will look like potentially. If you can make it more precise, fine, but if not, you kind of speak to it. Provide evidence. So if there are some case studies or examples that you can point to, if you're doing comparisons, there's country comparisons that you could use in some cases, or previous examples from other provinces or other jurisdictions, that's really helpful in kind of illustrating why this would be maybe an effective policy ask to act on. I don't know if John has any other.
Yeah, I think that covers it nicely. I would also add that we have a bullet point in here for provide evidence, which is important. And what we mean by that is that if you can demonstrate that if you make this investment in our organization, your return will be X, Y, and Z, or it will create this many jobs at this level of cost and this economic impact, go ahead and justify your ask that way with the real data. It's really important. If you don't have that data, don't pretend to have that data. And why I say that is it's never a good idea to say, if you invest $5 million in our sector right now, it will provide great economic impact to Ontario. If I'm the policy advisor reading through all of these documents in the minister's office, I'm going to call you on that. Because if you haven't explained how it's going to be economically viable or fiscally responsible, which is really important for this government, I'm going to question how you plan to achieve that. And if you can't demonstrate that, then you're not really going to have a chance. So evidence doesn't necessarily have to be math or hard data. It can be, and it's useful if it can be, but it can be case studies. It can be testimony from other like-minded organizations or other levels of government. For example, if you have a great relationship with your local city councilor or council or mayor even, and they can provide some kind of supporting documentation or commentary in your submission, that's worth exploring because they're going to look at what other governments think. So I would just keep that in mind on the evidence side, that you have to pick and choose carefully about what that means and how you demonstrate that return on investment. Now, return on investment is a financial term, but let's say you're asking for a policy objective. It doesn't have to be a financial return on investment. This, as we've discussed, Tashini and I already, this government is about making life easier on a day-to-day basis. If your policy objective makes life easier for working parents, for people working in agriculture, for young people, for old people, for middle-aged people, that is a great justification of your ask. So you just have to really think carefully and diligently about what your evidence is and what your return on investment is.
Great. So ONN has some asks. Yes, our pre-budget submission is underway, so we'll be sharing that with you maybe in a few weeks' time or a week or so. So our asks are, we have 5 asks here: burden reduction in nonprofit funding agreements, modernizing the police record check system for volunteers, a web portal for legislation affecting nonprofits, expanding access to the Infrastructure Ontario Loans Program, and maintaining Ontario Trillium Foundation funding at the 2018 budget levels. So I'll talk to one example in this, and maybe around the volunteers and modernizing the police record check system. For ONN, that means making life easier for volunteers. So in thinking about providing this recommendation, we're trying to kind of tie it into the government's kind of like, how do we make life simpler for people? How do we get them to participate more? How do we get them to do this or do that, and make it easier for them? So the police record check system, we know, can be quite complex. Different jurisdictions have different rules, or there's different costs. So how do we minimize, say, those costs across the system to allow volunteers to actually be able to volunteer and not and continue to participate in your organization? So that's just kind of one example of the framing and the thinking behind, say, providing this recommendation and how we would justify it. We have another example here coming up. So this is the recommendation around Ontario Trillium, and you've seen the notes, our action alerts, hopefully. So we have this ask. Our ask is fourth. We ask that the government maintain the current funding levels of the Ontario Trillium Foundation, which provides critical investments in services such as food banks, sports facilities, arts groups, and social service providers. Our ask is that you maintain the OTF at the level it's at now, because it plays a critical role in building healthy communities. So we still stuck to our kind of language that we like to use here at ONN, but we did point to the fact that these are critical investments. They support people. People are in communities, and these are the communities that need that support. So removing this will be removing that investment in some way. So trying to push that kind of language, but at the same time mediating it with like key examples, such as food banks, and speaking to kind of the local communities and the kind of work that happens in local communities as a way to kind of make that point.
I think if we just go back to the previous slide, we can delve into that just a little bit more. So this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Anyone off the street could read this page and understand what ONN is asking for, which is really important. But beyond that, if we delve a little deeper, the asks are very much pertinent for this government. So number one, burden reduction. That is an expression of this government. They just put out a bill about 2 months ago on burden reduction. So it's taking their language and using it for our gain, which is exactly what we want to do in this document. Yes. Selfishly, but it's true. Burden reduction and nonprofit funding agreements. If I'm a government staffer, this is already exciting to me. I want to see burden reduction. I didn't think there could be burden reduction in the nonprofit sector. Now I want to know more. So later on, Tashini's going to justify it by telling me how we can reduce burden together and enjoy that ask. Number two, modernizing the police record check system for volunteers. Modernizing is a great word. This government has a digital government strategy in the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services. There is an associate deputy minister specializing only on burden reduction through technology. Her name is Hillary Hartley. She's done this in the States in a few jurisdictions, so she's very experienced. So if you can tap into a priority like that, then you're really in a good spot. Similarly, number three, a web portal. Perfect. They want to digitize government again. They like expressions like digital migration to make things easier through burden reduction. That's a great one as well. Expanding access to the Infrastructure Ontario Loans program. You've identified a pot of money. You want them to expand that pot of money, and then what we're going to do afterwards is justify why it's worth their while. And number five, I think, is great, because while it's a negative issue that Trillium funding was cut, and I know that hurts a lot of us, rather than attack the government for making that decision, this ask accepts that decision and justifies the ask of restoring that funding, which is really important. You don't want to come out swinging in a document where you're asking for anything, which is counterintuitive, but we've seen people do it. So it's worth mentioning.
And also kind of the order of the ask as well. So can you
yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point. The order of these is really well done, in that probably the most low-hanging fruit, or the easiest one to do, is number one. We can explore that together between the nonprofit network and the government. Number two, still quite easy. We can explore that. It could be a priority for them as well. It touches finance, it touches government services, it touches community safety. Web portal, a little more complex, but still easy to do. And as we go down, those are really nicely numbered and prioritized.
So, what happens after you submit your pre-budget submission? Well, the budget gets written, drafted, released on budget day. Potentially, you've been asked to come to a lockup to get to have the budget read to you, and you read it and share the information with your organization. But generally, you read the budget after. Then you identify if your ask has been included in the budget. You find ways to thank government about that. So that could be following up and staying in contact with ministry staff and your MPP. Also follow up if you're unsure about an ask. If something in the budget comes up and you're curious about it, it's not clearly articulated to you what that means. Ask what it means. Find out what it means so you have a clear understanding and you're able to communicate that back once to your organization and the stakeholders that you provide support to, as well as just for further understanding of how you're going to move with the government going forward on maybe a particular issue. Also read ONN's budget analysis. We do one every year, so take some time to read through that. And John, do you have any other key advice you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think these cover it really well. I would also say that while the exercise of a pre-budget submission is to be you submit in the hopes that you're going to be invited to either a minister's consultation on the budget or the standing committee review of budgetary asks, which we'll get into a little bit later. If you don't get there, if you don't get that invitation, it's not something that your organization should take personally or look too deeply into. The reality is that government gets thousands upon thousands of asks, so they do have to be a little bit picky, and it depends on their priorities. So it's not to say that you've written it poorly or you haven't aligned with their priorities. It depends on their appetite and their capacity. All that being said, it's a great document to use from a go-forward basis because it's a proposal that you've already written, and you can use it for meetings as follow-up when the budget comes out, as a great talking point document, as a leave-behind document. And the other thing I would say is that Tashini's got in here, thank government. I think that's really important. Governments love to hear that they are doing a good job. And why that's important is that if the budget comes out and there is even one line in the budget that is remotely related to an ask that you had, you take that line, you write a press release, and you say, we congratulate the government on making the wise decision and the informed decision to help Ontarians buy X, Y, and Z. And then you can take that press release and you can share it with your contacts in the minister's office or your MPP's office and say, hey, we really appreciate the lead you've taken on this issue. We really look forward to coming back to you and speaking to you about it more and how we can help. It's just a great way to stay involved with government. Any political staffer or minister that tells you they don't like to hear they're doing a good job is lying, because it's just not true. So it's a really important piece to keep your momentum going as an organization after the budget is finished.
Mm-hmm. Also, I just want to go back to a point about sharing your asks, and when you're preparing your ask, think about also social media as a tool to kind of share them and get feedback on your ask and testing your ask, and share as well as in following up, share this information with your various stakeholders, partners, peers, see what they're saying and their reaction to the budget is, and see where there are opportunities for alignment and action that you can take. So I think this is the close of it. So just some notes. Submitting your submission. Basically, the deadline is February 8th to submit your pre-budget submission. You could send it to the Ministry of Finance at submission. Also, please send it to the Senate Standing Committee on Finance, because they may read it as well, and that may be included, even if you're not included, as John said, in kind of the consultation itself. That provides you with an opportunity to kind of submit that, and they'll definitely probably read that document. So we have that detailed information there for what you should be including. It's also on the Ontario government's website. Also, one more, participate and share the survey. So the government also has opened up a survey for comments as well. The deadline again is February 8th, 2019. So you can participate. The link is included here, and we'd encourage you to participate, share with your networks, share with other organizations. Some organizations might not have the time to do a full pre-budget submission, so this might be one way to communicate to government your ask or some of the issues that you'd like them to kind of address through this process. So don't forget to join us here at ONN. So we have our membership opportunity. Yes, so we have our membership. So if you want to know more about ONN and the advocacy and government relation work we're doing, you can check out our website and subscribe to our news and updates. So The webinar is just one way that ONN supports Ontario's nonprofit sector and bring the latest information and experts, John here, thank you, John, directly to you. So if you've found value in this webinar, the ONN membership program is another way to continue supporting ONN and supporting this type of work. And so if you're not already on the member list, please consider joining and helping us to strengthen the network. More info and many other benefits are provided on the website, and you could check it out. Also, we'd really like to thank John for being here today, and thank you for providing your insights and from your experience doing this type of work on a continual basis, and your work doing your work with the nonprofit sector in this space. And we also want to thank everyone for joining us online today. So we're going to take questions now. We did get a few questions through the slot there. If you want, we'll start with one of the questions we did get beforehand. So what is the difference between the consultations being held by the Ministry of Finance and the consultations being held by the Finance Committee? Start with that one.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Some distinctions.
The consultations being done by the Finance Committee are similar to any committee hearings that any committee, both federally or provincially, would be undertaken. So the committee is made up of members of all the different parties, Tories, Liberals, NDP, and they, as a group, have different time allotments for different witnesses they can invite to the committee. And so you will be invited by a member of the committee from one of the parties to give your pre-budget speech and also leave behind your pre-budget submission and outline your asks. And that is the role of the Finance Committee. So you might not get invited by the government. You might get invited by the Liberal member on that committee who feels that perhaps the not-for-profit sector needs to be represented in front of the committee, who's so far only heard from corporations or only heard from the environment sector or whatever it happens to be. So it's not specific to the government of the day. That being said, if you want an invitation to that committee and you get one, it's always a good idea to go, because while one party has to sponsor your participation, everybody can participate in asking you questions from all sides of the aisle. So it's a great networking opportunity with different MPPs, understanding where the different parties are at, who can support you, and things like that. And it's a worthwhile process. The ones done by the Ministry of Finance are selected by the government of the day. So that's the Minister's Office in Finance, or the recommendation of their colleagues in infrastructure or environment or other ministries. They've said that, you know, the not-for-profit network has a very, very strong budget submission. It's a perspective we won't have heard yet. We would like to invite them to come to one of our consultations, and both the Finance Committee and the ministry will have consultations across the province, so it doesn't necessarily have to be at Queen's Park. There's some in London, there's some in Ottawa, but that's really the main difference. Is in one, the government is asking you, and in the other, one of the parties is asking you to participate in front of the committee.
So we have a question we're taking from the chat. So someone asked, they are interested in the comment that you made that it's not so easy to get in front of the current government. They've been trying to secure a meeting with a PA since November and have written an initial request letter and have followed up by email and phone calls, but to date they haven't received a response. He's wondering if that's what you're referring to, and any suggestions of how to approach this type of situation.
Yeah, this is that's a great question, and definitely a common one that we've been hearing since this government took office. There's a few sort of tips and tricks I can share. So I think it's a great idea that you are targeting the parliamentary assistant, as they're not quite a minister. They are looking for things to keep them busy, if I'm being a little bit cynical, and they are more likely to take meetings. I would say that if you haven't done this already, the first stop is in any ministry. There will be or minister's office, I should say, there is a staff member who is assigned to the parliamentary assistant, and you can find them on the Infogo website. If you can get to that staff member first, have an introductory call, even an introductory meeting, because as a former staffer, I can tell you that our job first and foremost is to protect the castle, which means make sure that you're screening meetings that are worth your boss's time and not worth your boss's time. So you often have to, as a stakeholder, take that first meeting with the staff member or a few members of staff, and then the follow-up meeting is with the PA or the minister. So I would definitely advise that if that's the route that you've been going and you haven't really had the success that you were hoping for. Another option is to go right to the scheduler in the minister's office and try and deal with them directly. They hold the keys to the schedule, so that goes for the PA as well. You can also try their constituency office or their Queen's Park office if you're looking for a one-off meeting. But if you are submitting a meeting request without an agenda, that's going to be a problem. As a staffer, that's your first question is, a meeting sounds great, but what are we going to talk about?
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And an agenda doesn't have to be too complex. It can be 2 to 3 items even, but demonstrate your flexibility on where and when the meeting can take place is something else I would advise, or see if you can tag along to an event that they might be at. But I think if you try any of those, that should usually yield results.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll take another question here. Is it better to include hard data or compelling stories in our submission? What matters more to this government?
I would say that, following a lot of, I guess you would call them my talking points based on return on investment and things like that, you want to opt for hard data. But as I said, if you don't have hard data, it's not necessarily a problem. You just need to align with their priorities, as I said, and focus your efforts on that. So if you do have hard data, demonstrate it. And I mean, I can tell you that there's a not-for-profit arts organization I work with who undertook an economic impact study. And that's how we justify their return on investment, is we point to their economic impact and say it doesn't matter that it's an arts organization, they contribute to our provincial GDP. So it's a financial argument rather than an arts and culture argument. So that's the best advice I would give there.
Someone else has a question about how would this work around the pre-budget submission with a government that is not eager to spend money? So how do we, I think in the context of how do we kind of propose our asks with the government that is not eager to spend money? What should we be thinking about given that the government doesn't seem eager to do so?
I think, it's a great point. A lot of what this government has had to say in terms of talking points is their willingness or to cut if they want to cut and focus on fiscal responsibility. But that being said, any government at a certain point will have to spend money, and it's not to say that they're going to spend oodles and oodles of money, but again, if you have something that aligns with their priorities that is a financial ask, you can go ahead and justify that ask. It's not going to have massive repercussions unless you're asking for $1 billion when you should be asking for 200,000. So if you still have those priorities, you need to articulate them, but you just have to align it in a way that makes financial sense, is fiscally responsible, and has value for Ontarians. If you can do all of those things, then you can still ask for money.
Another question, would you advise organizations to submit jointly or to refer to one another in the submission, or is it best to have multiple independent submissions?
Good question. It really depends on the situation. I think that one thing that's hard for organizations to rectify internally or even as a group, and this is not criticism or reflective of just this sector, this is organization-wide across all sectors, is this comes back to knowing your audience. If the previous government in Ontario will probably recognize all of your organizations by name. This government might not. So you want to think about what implications that has. If I join with 3 other big not-for-profit organizations that carry household recognizable names, let's say the SPCA, the Humane Society, and one other that have recognizable names in animal welfare, then that might resonate really well. If I'm taking United Way, Not-for-Profit Network, and Ontario 211, those are all big names that are recognizable. But if I'm the Halton Peel chapter of something and a smaller organization, it doesn't have that impact that really is going to resonate with me as a government member of staff or a politician or whoever else. So I think you just need to evaluate internally if it's really going to be impactful, and no one is best situated to do that other than the organizations themselves.
Another question, do you submit your pre-budget submission to the Ministry of Finance and Treasury Board as well as, for example, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, or do you submit your pre-budget submission to one ministry only?
Very good question. follow Tashini's instructions with the portal. That's first and foremost. That's number one piece of homework for anybody. Secondly, let's say that in my pre-budget submission, I have 6 recommendations, and one is financial, one is Treasury Board, one is government services, one is health, and one is, name another ministry.
Community services, MCCSS.
Done. So I've got 5 or 6 different ministries in there. I'm going to submit to the portal, and then I'm going to take my submission and I'm going to send it to all of the relevant staff in those other ministries as a heads up. Hey, wanted to let you know we submitted our pre-budget document. We really like it. Here you go. Take a look through it. Let me know if there are any questions, or perhaps we could get together for a brief meeting to discuss the priorities you've laid out in here. Again, this is like first and foremost, it's a follow-up document that you just get to own, and you get to take to meetings and work with the government on. So definitely submit to those other ministries, and always useful to submit to your MPP if they're a member of the government. Just jumping ahead, we had a question here of, my local MPP is in opposition. Is it worth sharing the pre-budget submission with them? Absolutely it is. You want to make sure that you're going to the government first always, so including those members of Minister's Office staff. But if your organization is represented by an NDP MP, Green Party, or Liberal, it's worth them being in the know of what you're asking for, because maybe they want to send it to their reps on the Finance Committee. So always worth doing.
Yeah, always keeping those lines of communication open, because some of the stuff that you're proposing does affect that ministry, and they might have plans to do something in a certain way, and maybe you've provided them with a solution you don't even know. And that's a kind of like a segue into a conversation about how you can engage in that way, and they might be even more willing to push that ask if they see that alignment. So there are opportunities there. So sharing with obviously the relevant ministries, the line ministries, as well as the Treasury Board, Ministry of Finance, and MPPs and your PAs if they represent your riding or whatnot. I think that's a really good kind of step to take. So at least you're kind of like spreading out the communications, and you're making them aware that you exist as well, right? And that you have something important to say, and you're willing to work with government on all levels to actually engage in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just end that with, it is never a wise assumption to assume that ministries in the government are talking to one another, either on the political side or the bureaucratic side. So that alone is your justification for sharing your pre-budget document with anyone in any ministry, is that you just have to assume that they are not talking to finance and finance is not talking to them.
Another question, would you advise organizations to submit jointly or to refer to, I think I asked that question, sorry about that. Can you give more information on going to a budget lockup?
Sure. So what will happen on the date that, well, in advance of the date that the government has decided to release the budget, is they will host various lockups for different organizations. And what a lockup is if, for example, Tashini and I get invited on behalf of the nonprofit network, we will be invited to a government building at Queen's Park the day of the budget, a little bit before the budget speech is going to be read by the finance minister. We will check all of our electronics at the door, and we will sit in a locked room with staff from the Ministry of Finance, both on the political side and the bureaucratic side, who will give us advanced copies of the budget and take us through the various sections, well, the whole budget, but also the various sections that affect us as stakeholders. And that will give us a chance to dissect the budget a little bit before. If your organization, like the Nonprofit Network, does budget analysis, then we're going to rush out of there as soon as we get our cell phones back, and we're going to call our colleagues and say, this is what's in the budget for us, this is what isn't in the budget for us, we need to write a press release on these things. It doesn't, it doesn't necessarily provide you strategic advantage, but if the government has invited you, then it's usually a good indication that they want you to hear something that they've done for the sector. So it's important that way, and in those communication pieces afterwards. But it depends on what your relationship is like with finance, with the other ministries that are your aligned ministries, because every ministry sort of fights in a gentle way to have their stakeholders included. So that will be determined on whether you participate in the lockup or not.
How long is a typical budget submission? And also another question to that, because the government on the website, it says that it's supposed to be 500 words long, or the submission itself.
Mhm.
So how do we deal with kind of the length, or what length which should organizations be aiming for when putting together their pre-budget submission?
I mean, I'm a firm advocate of, regardless of the government of the day, that less is more, because that's just about knowing your audience. And I think that is also related to thinking about who's going to be reading it, how, if you were in their shoes, you would want to read it. You'd want short, you would want less, you would want concise, and you would want clear language. So, if you're writing a justification for one of your asks, think to yourself, can I say this in one line, and then go on to the next point? Can I say this in one line? If it takes more than that to explain what you're after, perhaps it's not worth saying. And I know that's harsh, but that's how the government is going to examine it as well. So while there's not really a magic number of it should be 2 pages, it should be 5 pages, I would just keep that in mind. And the format that we provided, that can be 2 pages, that can be 5 pages, that's no problem. And then if you need to justify your dollar amounts, your figures with economic impact or hard data, that can be attached as an appendix. That doesn't really count towards the length of the submission.
Yeah. Appendix are very useful when you're submitting anything, and if you want to submit any kind of diagrams, ideas, or projects that you think could be added in that, that's a really good tool to do so. Would you recommend including a version of the mapping exercise in the submission? I can answer that, and I can say no. I think it's more of an internal tool that you can use, and it helps your organization kind of think about the frame of mind and the framing that you want to proceed with, and also just think about as you go forward with, particularly with this new government, what are they talking about? How are they talking? And how are you attuned? Are you attuned to how they're talking? So it's more of getting feedback internally and kind of fostering that kind of frame of mind and thinking and how the government talks. So when you do develop your communications or any documents such as the pre-budget submission, you have that kind of in the back of your mind. Okay, so someone asked, how can the government expect feedback on the budget at the same time as they're receiving a pre-budget submission?
So the pre-budget submission is meant to help the government inform and direct their own budget. So they are going to, regardless of this process, they are going to determine that certain things are priorities for their budget. That being said, this process helps inform those priorities. Are those priorities going to resonate with voters? Are they going to resonate with stakeholders? Are there things that organizations are coming up with that relate closely to what I'm doing? And I can also tell you that while it is a condensed timeline of typically the portal opens in, say, November or late November for budget submissions, and the budget comes out in March and April, the dangers of not participating in this process far outweigh the positives. So I know it seems like a short timeline. Will they even take my advice seriously? I understand that that's a convenient way to think, and I don't mean to be typically harsh again, but being realistic, this is your opportunity to interact with the government in a way that they will understand. And if you don't take it, then if you try to meet with them afterwards and they say, oh, these are great priorities, why didn't you ask for them in the budget? Then you've got some explaining to do that you really don't want to be doing when you get that half an hour meeting with the minister or the minister's office. So while that timeline is condensed, it's very much worth doing.
So we're at the 1 o'clock mark. I don't know if you want to take a few more questions, and then we can end the session. So we had a few questions about the relational rationale or benefit of either doing the free form submission or the survey. Which one is better?
I think that the survey is more geared as a political exercise. Not saying it's not worth doing, but it's more of a political exercise to show that as a government, I'm engaging with the public. I'm asking the public what they think by having them fill out this survey. The submission is the better way to go for organizations. There's no question.
Can you expand on how specific the ask should be? We kind of talked about it there in regards to, like, if you can say it in one sentence, go ahead. But could you be a little bit more, provide some more context around how specific an organization should be when they're providing their ask? Yeah,
for sure. I think using again the example of a financial ask, especially with this government, you want to get into specifics. And I'm not talking about the nitty gritty, but I would not structure an ask as I would like $5 million for mental health programming. okay. That's a pretty wide berth of things. So rather, I would say, we are requesting a $5 million investment in mental health programming that will assist Ontario veterans who have returned from Afghanistan and their families on the subject of PTSD. And then so you've got that nice one line, and then when you go into your justification later on, you can say the rates of PTSD among veterans from Afghanistan who were in the Canadian Forces are this percentage high. We know that it affects this many families out of 10 and things like that. So you've gotten into a really specific problem that you're trying to fix. And that's what the budget is ideally trying to address is, are they fiscal problems? Are they policy problems? But it's about overcoming issues and providing more value to people. So if you can do that in a specific way, that's really important.
We have another question. If we ask the clerk of the standing committee to make an oral presentation in January and have not heard back yet, does that mean we're likely not going to have the opportunity to be heard?
It depends. I know that's not an answer that provides much comfort, but if you submitted an email to the clerk or maybe left them a voicemail or had a brief phone conversation and you haven't heard anything back, the clerk might be very busy. It's always a good idea to make friends with the committee clerk because they, organize the schedule, can give you the heads up, and aren't tied to a single political party. But it really depends what your interaction has been. If you've emailed them 20 times and the clerk has responded 20 times saying, I don't know yet, probably not. But if you've sort of left it open-ended and you're waiting for a response, follow up with them again. Try following up with any allies in government that you might have, be they minister's office folks, local MPPs, and so on, or members of the committee itself. But I would encourage follow-up if you haven't heard anything.
Oh, this is a really interesting question. We are a French organization. Is it better to submit in English?
Ooh, tough question. I think it's worth doing both. In terms of this government hasn't really shown, as I'm sure you're aware, that its willingness to operate well with the Francophone community. And I think there's a chance that will improve, but I think it's worth submitting in both languages just for the sake of submitting in English to make sure that it's going to be digested easily. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head if there are staff in the finance ministry that are bilingual. I'm sure there are some, but you don't want to run that risk. And at the same time, your membership can be content if you decide to share your submission with your membership that you've written it in French, staying true to your roots as an organization. Not to sound placating, but I think doing both if you can are important, just given the political realities today.
Yeah, I could speak to that as well. Being bilingual myself, I worked federally before in the federal context. Everything that we send is bilingual, and I would encourage organizations, if they do have the capacity to send documents in both languages, to kind of encourage that practice. If you have the time or if you think it's necessary, I think that's great. And if you are a Francophone organization, I say go ahead. It's a really good thing to do, to have both French and English in any kind of documentation that you actually are presenting. Maybe two more questions. Sure. And then, is it better to work within previously announced budgetary commitments or reach for your ideal spending scenario? Any advice for sectors or organizations that have already faced cuts?
I don't think it's wise to draw on the funding investments or the funding priorities of a government that is not the current government. Regardless of what stripe they are. Like, I don't think it's a good idea to go to this government and say, well, in Harris's time, they made this investment, which doesn't sound like Mike Harris, but for the sake of argument, they made this investment and that was great. Not all Tories remember the Harris years as good years. So if they don't remember those years fondly, they're not going to remember the Kathleen Wynne years fondly, which is what they prescribe and dictate as having caused this massive deficit. So you have to be very careful. It's not a great idea to align yourself with spending that came from their predecessors. And if you're going to address the cuts that you faced, I think you should look at what the nonprofit network used in terms of language on the Trillium funding cuts, because they're, as you can see from the language, it's not incendiary. It's not objectionable. This is something that happened. We understand that this happened. We still think it's useful, and that's why you should go back to what it was, and here's why it's useful as an investment. I know that doesn't provide comfort or solace on the fact that you've faced cuts already, but again, if you want to speak this government's language, you have to speak to their priorities and what they think they're doing well, not their predecessors.
One more question. We'll try to, I think we have a few more, but we're going to take the one last question, and then we'll see if John can answer some of those later on, and maybe a little text, and we'll provide that answer to individuals. Is there any time when it might be advantageous to recognize that your priorities just don't align and advocate from the outside?
I mean, I've certainly been in that realm before, working with various organizations and clients. I think you have to walk a very fine line, and for any organizations that participated in Ontario for All this summer, you're probably sick of my voice by this point, because I was at a couple of events sort of advocating for how to deal with a new government that might not be as friendly as their predecessors. It's always better to try the internal route and work with government first and go to government first, because the people that are sitting across from you in the minister's office campaigned for the government. They campaigned for this change. They campaigned for the election that they fought hard and they won for, which these staffers did. It might not be the government that I wanted, or you wanted, but they're here and they hold the cards right now. So it's better to develop relationships with them. But if your champions are not going to be the Minister of Finance and the Premier, that's okay. You need to find other champions. Can you find a parliamentary assistant to a minister who's really passionate about what you're advocating, and they can make it their pet issue? Maybe your local MPP is a Tory MPP, is looking for an issue and really likes what you're doing. Find a different champion and make that a champion in the government. I think that's always going to serve you better than going outside in.
So on that note, just one more question, and then we're going to close it. Like agencies, how do agencies work in that kind of conversation, or how do we engage agencies then that might have some of those same priorities that we have, and how do we have that conversation as we're kind of liaising with government to push these conversations as well?
I think you have to have a conversation with those agencies that kind of does what this webinar is proposing, is what are our priorities? Do they align at all? Why don't they align? And I think realistically, you have to pick your battles with government. If something doesn't align and is just so far out of the realm of the possible, you have to have that conversation with yourselves internally and figure out, is this worth pursuing? Is this not worth pursuing? And again, if there can be a champion on the issue, then find them, identify them, work with them, and build them up to be your champion. But sometimes the priorities don't come together. Sometimes they don't work out. And that's why you need more than one priority as an agency or as an organization. Pick the battles that you can win, and that's where you really want to focus your attention.
Well, I think that's it for our webinar today. Thank you again to John for being here and providing such deep insight on all of this. And we want to thank everyone online for joining us today. We hope the webinar has given you useful information and steps as your organization prepares its pre-budget submission, and also any other types of communications. We invite you to look at ONN's website for, as John said, sources of information for language and context. We'll be sending a follow-up email with the recording, pre-budget submission template, and the slide deck. So a quick reminder, don't forget to send your pre-budget submission to the website as is listed in the PowerPoint. And we hope everyone has a good afternoon, and we look forward to seeing your pre-budget submission. So don't forget to share. Thank you.